Conspiracy theories. That one word elicits a variety of different emotions. One's first response may be that of scoffing or amusement. Conspiracy theories are explanations for strange or up until now unexplained phenomena, wherein the explanations proposed tend to be fanciful, to say the least, often multi-layered and complex or even convoluted at times, connecting a wide variety of different and seemingly unconnected elements. Most conspiracy theories have little or no evidence to support them, and some of their quote-unquote evidences include things ranging from debunked or unverified scientific theories, hearsay or second-hand accounts, or strange coincidences or parallels. Some conspiracy theories are so outlandish and have been debunked so many times that it almost makes us laugh just to hear them, thereby giving them a quasi-meme status. Some conspiracy theories are clearly the result of paranoid minds seeking explanations for strange or catastrophic events. Yet, there have been, throughout history, conspiracy theories that turned out to be true, and others, which though unproven or even disproven, resemble real-life events enough to seem, on the surface, probable. Thus, while conspiracy theories often cause a laugh, or confusion-induced aneurysms, conspiracy theories, or even just the idea of conspiracy theories, can also at times cause intense fear. What if they are true? Is there anything I can do about it to fix the situation? What if there isn't? Now, why am I, the host of a theology-based YouTube channel, talking about conspiracy theories? Well, some of these conspiracy theories touch on religious issues, or claim that certain religious or quasi-religious groups, institutions, or leaders are involved. 99% of the time, it's usually one of these five guys. I've touched on similar conspiracy theories in the past. For example, back in October of 2021, I made a video debunking Joe Rogan's claim that the Emperor Constantine invented the New Testament. But the emphasis there was on the history of the Bible, more so than on the conspiracy element of it. Well, I hope to devote part of my YouTube channel just to discussing these religious-themed conspiracy theories. Part of the reason for this is because it is part and parcel of my duty as a Catholic to defend the Catholic faith, and one way that I do so is through teaching people the faith, part of which includes combating misinformation. Yet, let's get real. Some conspiracy theories are so outlandish, so out there, that part of it is just fun to listen to. Just remember, most of the conspiracy theories that I will touch on are false, based on outright lies, or partial truths, or are based on misunderstandings of the teachings, practices, or history of the Catholic Church, or some other religion. So I wouldn't take these conspiracy theories all too seriously. We should take them seriously only insofar as counteracting them is necessary to spread the truths of the faith, and thus, by tearing back the illusion, we showcase the glory of Christ and His Church. Now, while most of the religious-themed conspiracy theories that I will be touching on tend to be anti-Catholic in nature, or tend to be just more general misinformation connected with religion, there are some conspiracy theories that were developed by Catholics and are meant to describe strange or catastrophic events within the Church. There isn't necessarily any animosity on the part of the people who promote these theories, but insofar as they deal with strange or interesting parts of Church history, they are actually very interesting to look at. Now, I personally was never a big follower of conspiracy theories, but there's one religious-themed conspiracy theory that I have taken an almost morbid curiosity in, the past roughly decade, and that is the Siri thesis. It goes something like this. While there have been a few different versions of the theory, the most popular form says that Cardinal Giuseppe Siri, a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church and the Catholic Archbishop of Genoa in Italy, was the one elected pope in the 1958 papal conclave, instead of Cardinal Angelo Roncalli, who would later take on the papal name of John the 23rd. Yet Freemasons and communists, who saw themselves as the ideological enemies of the Church, had representatives who infiltrated the ranks of the Catholic Church, and these communist and Masonic agents began to put pressure on Cardinal Siri to resign his position immediately after he was elected. This was because Cardinal Siri, a more ideologically conservative churchman, was firmly rooted in Catholic orthodoxy and was strongly opposed to communism and Freemasonry. Yet, in order to become the Pope, one must not only be elected by the majority of one's fellow cardinals, but one must also choose to accept this position. Since Cardinal Siri had already been elected and chose to accept this position, he was technically the Pope, but resigned within moments of his election. Nonetheless, the conspiracy goes on to say, according to the Code of Canon Law, if a pope resigns from his position due to force or coercion, the resignation is invalid. Therefore, because Cardinal Siri was forced to resign from the papal office due to pressure from outside influences, he was still, technically speaking, the pope, and knew that this was the case. Cardinal Siri thus, while pretending to be a cardinal, privately went about attempting to fulfill his duties as pope to the best that he could in secret, even going as far as appointing secret cardinals and establishing an entire administrative structure that paralleled that found in the mainstream church, which worked to elect a new pope after Siri died. Unfortunately, Siri was prevented by corrupt churchmen from going public with his claim to be the true pope, and thus only a small handful of people knew the truth. Even today, we don't know who Cardinal Siri's successor in the papacy is, or even how many successors he's had, for the situation is still too dangerous for the successors of Cardinal Siri to go public. Now, this conspiracy theory exemplifies everything that is wrong with the conspiracy theory. Upon further examination, it proves to be based primarily on hearsay and circumstantial evidence, and even if Cardinal Siri was, in fact, the true pope, there are a series of canonical reasons as to why his successors wouldn't actually themselves be valid popes. As a result, the main reason why people tend to accept this conspiracy theory is because they don't like the way things are being done in the church these days. Yet if Cardinal Siri had been elected pope, then chances are things would have been different and better. And if Cardinal Siri and his secret successors were in fact the quote-unquote real popes, then we can ignore the guy in Rome who claims to be the pope because he isn't actually the real pope. In spite of all of this is a theory that I find to be quite intriguing because it firstly sheds a lot of light on the mindset of certain more radical, fringe ideologies within the church, and secondly, on the surface, it doesn't seem like that out there of a conspiracy theory. Cardinal Siri was, in fact, one of the most prominent churchmen of his time, and was almost elected pope on several occasions. We also know that groups like the Freemasons and the Communists have long been antagonistic towards Catholicism. Further, those who participate in papal conclaves take a vow of secrecy, and thus we don't necessarily know all the details of what happens during any particular papal conclave. Thus, there is a certain air of mystery surrounding the conclaves, and thus it is easy to create fanciful speculations and believe in rumors about what actually happened during a conclave. Thus, while this conspiracy theory is false, on the surface, it seems more realistic than a lot of other conspiracy theories. But before we can get into the conspiracy theory itself, let's step back and look at some history. Cardinal Giuseppe Siri was born on May 20th, 1906, in Genoa, Italy. His parents were Niccolo and Giulia Siri. Siri's father, Niccolo, was born in 1874 in the town of Vera Superiore in northwestern Italy. Niccolo's family had been living in that region since at least the early 17th century. Niccolo's father, also named Giuseppe, had been twice married. With his first wife, he had 4 children, the youngest of whom was Niccolo. Shortly after Niccolo's birth, his mother died and his father remarried. Yet the financial expenses caused by his wife's illness caused the financial ruin of the family, and they lost their large estate, which the family had lived on for several centuries. Niccolo, his father, and his siblings relocated to Camernia, a small coastal town just outside of where Niccolo was born. In spite of their hardships, the family remained relatively tight-knit, and many members of his family were highly respected members of the community. For example, Niccolo's oldest brother, Bernard, had a reputation for being a morally upright, highly religious man, and for having a good memory, and thus was often asked to mediate or settle disputes within the larger community. When Niccolo was only 13, his father died. One of his father's last pieces of advice was that Niccolo devote his life to constant prayer, something that he took to heart. At the age of 16, he moved out of his parents' house to support himself. He got a job as a greengrocer in the town of Volti, just outside of Genoa. After this, he would work a series of other jobs, including as a domestic servant for a local Italian politician and as a stevedore, which is basically just another term for a manual laborer who worked on the docks. Niccolo's wife, Giulia, was born in the town of Gatteo, along the eastern coast of Italy. When her family faced financial ruin, Giulia, who at the time was only 17, could no longer rely on her family for financial support, and thus moved out of her parents' house. She supported herself by working a variety of different jobs. In spite of being a working woman, she was also a very cultured woman, frequently attending the opera and taking an interest in the arts. Niccolo and Giulia married in February of 1905 at the Basilica of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Rome. A year later, Giuseppe Siri, the future Cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, was born. The Siri household highly emphasized hard work. Niccolo Siri was strongly devoted to his work, waking up early in the morning and often working until late at night, only taking a few hours off from work in the evening to eat dinner with his family. His mother was strongly devoted to the domestic affairs of the family, though his father would frequently take over these tasks on Sundays in order to give his wife time to relax. Yet they were households that also strongly emphasized the role of religion. They would regularly pray together as a family, and Siri's father frequently took time off from work to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. It was this context that inspired Siri to become a priest. He was ordained a priest in 1928, at the young age of 22, by Bishop Carlo Minoretti, the Archbishop of Genoa, and Siri served in that archdiocese for most of his career. Yet Siri was not just a devout man, he was also a scholarly one as well. He was educated at the local seminary, but later went on to study at the Pontifical Gregorian University, where he received his doctorate in theology. Shortly after his ordination, Father Siri became involved in the Catholic Action, and it was with this group that he spent most of his early pastoral and ecclesial activity. Catholic Action was a lay Catholic activist group formed in the 19th century in Europe that attempted to promote various elements of Catholic social and moral teaching and fight against the anti-clerical trends of some of the more radical social and political movements of that time. Over the years, many other educational and activist groups formed that were inspired by various elements of the ideology and methods of the Catholic Action, including the Young Christian Students Movement, the Cursillo movement in Spain and South America, and the various workers' rights advocacy groups founded by the Catholic Church or influenced by its teachings. On May 7, 1944, in the midst of the Second World War, Father Siri was consecrated a bishop. He had been appointed as auxiliary bishop of the Archdiocese of Genoa, as well as the titular bishop of Villegas in the Holy Land. He was consecrated a bishop by Cardinal Pietro Botteo, the Archbishop of Genoa. While serving as auxiliary bishop, Siri did much to help the city of Genoa in the midst of the battles that immediately surrounded it. Siri, for example, met with both Allied and Nazi forces to arrange a Nazi surrender in a series of battles raging near his diocese, thereby protecting the city of Genoa from sustaining any further damage. In January of 1946, Cardinal Botteo died at the age of 74. Siri was chosen to be his successor, assuming the role in May, a little over a week after his 40th birthday. He was appointed a cardinal by Pope Pius XII in 1953 at the age of 47. While serving as the archbishop of one of the most important dioceses in Italy, he also participated in all 4 sessions of the Second Vatican Council. He also served as the president of the Italian Bishops' Conference from 1959 to 1965. He retired from the episcopacy in July of 1987 at the age of 81. Over the course of his career as bishop, he ordained as priests 14 men who would later go on to become bishops, 3 of whom went on to become cardinals, and one of whom, Francesco Moraglia, is the current Patriarch of Venice. He was also the principal consecrator of 11 bishops, one of whom, Archbishop Giacomo Leccaro, the Archbishop of Ravenna and later the Archbishop of Bologna, went on to become a cardinal, and 4 of whom went on to become archbishops. Cardinal Siri died on May 2, 1989, a few weeks after his 83rd birthday. Most of the supporters of the Siri thesis, when attempting to show that Cardinal Siri was actually the true pope, tried to demonstrate this as probable, since it is a matter of public record that Cardinal Siri was considered papabile in many of the papal elections that he took part in. Papabile is an Italian term that literally means popeable, as in, this guy is pope material, and is another term used to apply to Catholics who are seen as likely to be elected in a papal election. This is something acknowledged both by mainstream news sources, popular publications, and even official declassified government documents. For example, let's wind the clock back all the way to 1958. The reigning Pope, Pope Pius XII, dies, and a conclave meets to elect his successor. Cardinal Siri was considered by many at that time to be one of the leading candidates among the more ideologically conservative churchmen. Cardinal Siri, in the popular eye, was seen as an ideological conservative, with one New York Times article published on the occasion of his death describing him as a quote-unquote arch-conservative. This can be seen in his belief that what the church needed more than anything was a strict adherence to its traditional doctrines, his strong opposition to communism, and later on, his attempts to block some of the reforms proposed by the Second Vatican Council. Siri himself rejected the label of conservative, saying in one interview, quote, "If I had to describe myself, I would describe myself as an independent, a man who walks alone and is not a member of any group," unquote. In spite of his rejection of labels, one article dated to October of 1958 describing the unfolding of the conclave noted that most of the cardinals fell into one of two categories: conservatives and innovators. Conservatives were defined as those who supported ideological centrism, a centralized church structure, and an adherence to more traditional pastoral or leadership styles. Innovators, on the other hand, desired a more libertarian or decentralized approach to ecclesial organization, and who desired to explore newer pastoral and leadership styles. Cardinal Siri was seen as being within the camp of the conservatives. In the immediate aftermath of Pope Pius's death, many believed that Cardinal Siri was the most likely conservative candidate, though as the conclave and its organization progressed, some began to see Siri as a less viable candidate and believed that the more populare candidates would be the more moderate or liberal ones. It is a well-established fact that Siri was, of all the cardinals in Rome during the reign of Pope Pius XII, the one favored by Pope Pius to be his successor. Declassified government documents show that, like with the 1958 papal election, in the papal election of 1963, the biggest issue at stake was the theological differences between progressives and conservatives. Cardinal Siri, along with Cardinal Ruffini, Cardinal Ottaviani, Cardinal Gonfalonieri, and Cardinal Agagian, were counted among those who either supported or were considered the most viable candidates from the more moderate or conservative camp. The conspiracy theorist Paul L. Williams writes that the CIA, wanting to curtail the rise of a liberal pope who would be quote-unquote soft on communism, closely watched the 1963 conclave and even attempted to promote a Siri election, Siri being one of the candidates most sympathetic to the political policy of the United States. Not only was Siri a runner-up in both the 1953 and 1963 conclaves, but was also a runner-up in the 1978 conclave that led to the election of Pope St. John Paul II. We know that Cardinal Siri was a runner-up in the 1958 conclave, yet there are certain strange events surrounding the 1958 conclave which would eventually lead to the rise of the Siri thesis as it exists today. On October 26, 1958, There were 4 voting sessions during the conclave. At 11:53 a.m., at the end of the first 2 sessions, black smoke was released from the chimney of St. Peter's Basilica, indicating that the voting session was inconclusive in choosing a pope. In the late afternoon, more specifically at 5:57 p.m., black smoke went up again. Yet, when the smoke went up just before noon on that day, it at first appeared gray, and only later turned black. Many believed that a pope had been elected. A column from the New York Times states that dozens of reporters began to contact their respective media outlets to report the news. The number of people who began to gather at St. Peter's Square, believing that a pope had been elected, numbered literally in the thousands. The Vatican guards began to assume their position in order to prepare for the ceremonies that would follow. Even a priest serving as the announcer for the Vatican radio was confused, announcing that a pope had been elected. The National Associated Press Agency, one of the largest news organizations in Italy at that time, picked up on this story and began to broadcast it throughout Italy. There was even a story of a wedding taking place in St. Peter's Basilica at that time, but when rumors of a papal election began to circulate, those in the wedding ran out of the basilica to join the crowds. It was announced that the initial gray smoke was the result of technical difficulties, and that the substances used to turn the smoke black had been malfunctioning. The cardinals were to be briefed to address this issue and remedy it. This leads to the question, why was the smoke originally this grayish color? If a pope hadn't been elected, why wasn't the smoke black all along? According to supporters of the Siri thesis, the notion that the gray smoke turning black was the result of a technical difficulty was really a cover for a more nefarious series of events. According to supporters of the thesis, Cardinal Siri had been elected as pope by the majority of his fellow cardinals, and had chosen to assume this role, taking on the name of Pope Gregory XVII. Those responsible for releasing the white smoke began to do so, but at the last minute, they were told to make the smoke black. Cardinal Siri had resigned from his papal office. This explains why the smoke was originally this grayish color instead of pure white, and eventually turned black. It was originally meant to be white smoke signifying that a pope had been elected, but that the substances that make the smoke black were added only after the white smoke had been released. Cardinal Siri was pressured into resigning by Masonic and communist infiltrators in the church. Now, it is an established historical fact that both communists and the Freemasons had strong anti-Catholic tendencies. The Permanent Instruction of the Alta Vendita, a document published by the Cardinal, an Italian secret society with close ties to the Freemasons, outlines a plan to subvert the Catholic Church from within, influencing ecclesiastical affairs in such a way that a pope will get elected who is sympathetic towards their ideas. This would be done primarily through creating cultural and ideological trends that corrupt the up-and-coming generation of youths and seminarians. For example, one part of the document says, quote, "Our ultimate end is that of the French Revolution, the final destruction of Catholicism and even of the Christian idea. Pope, whoever he is, will never come to the secret societies. It is up to the secret societies to take the first step towards the Church, with the aim of conquering both of them. We do not intend to win the popes to our cause, to make them neophytes of our principles, propagators of our ideas. That would be a ridiculous dream. What we must ask for, what we should hope for, is a pope according to our needs. Now then, to assure ourselves of a pope of the required dimensions, it is a question first of shaping for this pope a generation worthy of the reign we are dreaming of. Leave old people and those of mature age aside. Go to the youth. and if it is possible, even to the children. Lay your snares in the sacristies, the seminaries, and the monasteries, rather than at the bottom of the sea." Unquote. On the other hand, many of the communist governments that were in power at that time were strongly anti-religious. In many communist nations, churches and religious artifacts were destroyed. Many major religions were either highly regulated, outright banned, or turned into puppets of the government. Anti-religious, including and especially anti-Christian and anti-clerical propaganda, was widespread in countries governed by communist dictatorships. Now, there is circumstantial evidence that would seem to demonstrate the Siri thesis, but is there any direct evidence of it? Unfortunately, there's none that I personally could find. I would venture to say that if you know anything about totalitarian dictatorships or secret societies, direct documentary records would either be non-existent or very difficult to obtain. There probably wouldn't be records about such an event in the church, but if there were, they would most likely be kept in the Vatican archives, which have strict regulations on who can access what. Like, you need special permission in order to access most of the stuff in there, and usually it's only open to scholars or researchers or other clergymen, and not everything in the Vatican archives is open to public viewing. There have been some, though, who claim that these events are true based on eyewitness testimony. The two most famous examples would be the Jesuit priest Father Malachi Martin and the Vietnamese priest Father Pierre Quat Van Tran. Father Malachi Martin was born in County Kerry in Southern Ireland in 1921. He spent his college years studying the Semitic languages and many of the historical elements connected with theology, particularly biblical studies, and received doctorates from such universities as Oxford University, the University of Louvain in Belgium, and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Ordained a priest for the Jesuit order in 1954, he was a prolific scholar, being involved in a lot of the early research surrounding the Dead Sea Scrolls. He went on to become a secretary for Cardinal Augustin Bey, and worked closely with both Cardinal Bey and Pope St. John XXIII. He also served as a secretary in the 1963 Papal Conclave, the one that elected Pope St. Paul VI. According to Father Martin, he was tasked with a lot of important jobs around the Vatican, including intel reconnaissance behind the Iron Curtain. Some sources say that he was laicized in the mid-1960s. To be laicized means that while you are still technically a priest, you are released from all of your duties and obligations, as well as all of your privileges as a priest. And you return to the lay state, in the sense that while you're still technically a priest, you either choose to leave the priestly ministry, or you are forced to leave the priestly ministry, and the church treats you no different than how it would treat other laymen. Martin himself affirms that he was laicized, and some sources say that he was laicized by his own initiative, no longer wanting to be involved with the power politics involved with Vatican administration. Other sources seem to indicate that he was not laicized, that he simply left the Jesuit order or was released from some of his vows that he had taken when he became a Jesuit, but was still allowed to continue to say Mass privately. Father Martin was very active in the Vatican during and in the immediate lead-up to Vatican II. And although Martin was initially a theological liberal, he became disillusioned by the council and towards the end of his career became very sympathetic towards the traditionalist movement. Unfortunately, Father Martin died in 1999 at the age of 78, but in the last roughly 20 years or so of his life, he wrote a lot of books, some of which were historical, but some were fictional, based on, according to him, real events that he had either directly witnessed or heard about in the Vatican. A lot of his books, both fiction and non-fiction, were inspired by supposed conspiracies taking place in the Vatican. He is thus a popular figure among traditionalists, particularly among those of a more conspiracy-minded bent. In an interview with him in 1997, Father Martin affirms the Siri thesis. He says the following:
just so the listeners understand the position where he's coming from and where I'm coming from on that. Now, Malachi, earlier as we run into the station break, you were talking about the issue of you being elected Pope, that this obviously didn't happen, that somebody other than John Paul could have been elected, that there were choices. Tell us more about that.
Instead of John Paul II, he had the choice of Cardinal Siri of Geneva, who would have done exactly what I'm to say I would do. And he was elected Pope. He got the votes in the same conclave in October 1978, and he was told by a little handwritten note that if he accepted, he would die, and his family would die. So he refused the pontificate.
Another figure often cited by supporters of the Siri thesis in support of their theory is Father Peter Quat Van Tran. Born in 1939 in the Vietnamese city of Dalat in southern Vietnam, Father Quat Van Tran was ordained a priest in 1967. Like many people from that part of the world, Father Quat Van Tran left Vietnam and migrated to the United States as a result of the political instability and tensions surrounding the Vietnam War. Father Quat Van Tran eventually settled in Texas, and it's interesting because according to the information that I was able to find, Father Quat Van Tran coordinated the mass migration of large numbers of people from Vietnam to the United States, and in fact was responsible for helping to build up and minister to the needs of the Vietnamese community in the United States, particularly in Texas, and he was particularly active in this area back in the 1970s, doing a lot to help Vietnamese refugees displaced by the Vietnam War. The reason why Father Quat Van Tran is often considered important or significant for supporters of the Siri thesis is because he himself had traveled to Europe several times and met Cardinal Siri directly. There are many reports from people who know or claim to know Father Quat Van Tran saying that he had directly asked Cardinal Siri, and this was probably in the late 1980s, so towards the end of Cardinal Siri's life, whether or not he was actually the Pope or had ever been elected Pope, and Cardinal Siri told him yes. This was something testified to both by supporters of the Siri thesis as well as by Father Quat Van Tran himself, who asserted that Cardinal Siri had been elected Pope in an oft-cited 2006 sermon he delivered.
The Pope gave us the 17th command to fulfill the message of the gospel. Rome, you lose faith and become the seat of Antichrist. The Pope gave us 17 to fulfill the message, prophecies of the Fatima. You don't pray the version of Russia. Then Russia will bring the large error to whole world, and Holy Father will suffer so much From the day I met Pope Gregory XVII on June 14, 1980, I saw his eye, and I never forget. The eye of suffering, the eye of sorrow, the eye of humility, the eye of love. His eye always follows me, day, time, night time. Even I wake up, his eye follows me.
Some supporters of the Siri thesis assert that Father Quat Van Tran had himself been elected as the successor of Cardinal Siri, that he himself was the Pope in hiding. But I haven't been able to find a whole lot of information directly supporting this opinion, and Father Quat Van Tran, while still alive, is notoriously difficult to come in contact with, especially since he travels a lot, and he also does a lot of other work besides acting as a priest. For example, I know he was very active as an entrepreneur. And so, with that in mind, it's very difficult to collect a lot of information on Father Quat Van Tran. Some have called into question the reliability of Father Quat Van Tran. I'll actually include a link to an article that spells out some of the reasons why Father Quat's testimony is unreliable. But one of the most important things to keep in mind is that Father Quat, when he met with Cardinal Siri, and he did actually meet with Cardinal Siri, there is documentary evidence of this, but he never actually included any documentation whereby we could independently verify what Cardinal Siri said to him. Therefore, if Cardinal Siri admitted to Father Quat Van Tran that he had in fact been elected Pope, we would have no way of proving that he actually said this. Now, I personally don't believe the Siri thesis. Nonetheless, there's a lot of elements of it that, on the surface, make it make sense to me as to why some people, even some otherwise reasonable people, would believe in it. Like with any good conspiracy theory, that is, a conspiracy theory that may or may not be true but on the surface seems plausible, more specifically, conspiracy theorists look at strange things or odd coincidences happening in real life that either aren't already explained or aren't easily explainable in a non-conspiratorial fashion, or where explanations tend to be incomplete or only partial due to a lack of information, and create their own, often fanciful, explanations of it. We know, for example, that Cardinal Siri was a prominent churchman prior to the 1958 election. We also know, for example, that Cardinal Siri was considered a candidate in multiple papal elections, including the 1958 election. We know that Cardinal Siri was more ideologically conservative, and thus members of organizations, movements, or ideologies often at odds with the Catholic Church, including Freemasons and Communists, wouldn't have been overly pleased at the election of Cardinal Siri. We also know that there was confusion surrounding the whole gray smoke that everyone thought was white smoke but turned out to be black smoke thing. It thus seems easy to put two and two together. Cardinal Siri was elected pope, but was forced to resign immediately after accepting the papal office due to pressure from the enemies of the church. Unfortunately, there are some problems with this thesis. First off, a lot of the evidence is he said, she said sort of stuff. While I see no reason, for example, to believe that Father Martin is untrustworthy, especially considering his work with the Vatican and his previous work as a scholar, there really isn't much direct evidence to corroborate anything that he said, and most of the evidence that does exist tends to be circumstantial. Further, while there is evidence that Father Quat Van Tran did meet Cardinal Siri, or knew him even if only in passing, there's not a lot of evidence that says that Father Quat Van Tran had been elected as the successor of Cardinal Siri, or that Cardinal Siri had said to Father Quat Van Tran what he or any of his supporters claim that he said. Further, on some level, the Siri thesis is, at least emotionally and ideologically, self-defeating. Most of the people who support the Siri thesis are sedevacantists, that is, people who believe that the Second Vatican Council taught error, and that most of the popes who came to power since Vatican II, since they accepted the council, were heretics and therefore not validly elected popes. It makes sense why they would be attracted to the Siri thesis. If Cardinal Siri had been elected pope, things would have been very different in the church. And if Cardinal Siri was elected pope, this means that there is an alternative to the mainstream. We don't have to go to the sacramentally or canonically invalid hierarchy of the church. We actually have someone to turn to who can lead the church in a legitimate way. It also helps a lot of people to overcome one of the stumbling blocks of sedevacantism. According to most of the mainstream, standard, run-of-the-mill forms of sedevacantism, the last validly elected pope was Pope Pius XII, who died in the late 1950s. Most sedevacantists don't believe in the Siri thesis, which thus means that we haven't had a pope since the late 1950s. But it's problematic to say that the church can go on indefinitely without a pope, especially since most of the priests, bishops, and cardinals made during the reign of Pope Pius XII are either dead or retired, and thus most forms of sedevacantism create a hole that we have no way of getting out of. Nonetheless, the Siri thesis doesn't actually lead to this conclusion. That is to say, the Siri thesis doesn't actually lead to a way out of the problems caused by sedevacantism. According to the Code of Canon Law, Even the 1917 edition of the Code of Canon Law, the version that would have been used at the time of Cardinal Siri's supposed election, a cardinal who is secretly elected does not have the rights and responsibilities of a cardinal. Hence, any attempt to, quote, elect a pope done by a secret cardinal wouldn't actually be canonically valid. According to the Code of Canon Law, more specifically Canon 233, Sections 1 and 2 in the 1917 edition of the Code of Canon Law, which would have been the edition of the Code of Canon Law in effect at the time when Cardinal Siri was supposedly elected Pope, as well as in Canon 351, Sections 1 through 3 of the 1983 edition of the Code of Canon Law, the edition of the Code of Canon Law currently in effect, cardinals assume their authority as cardinals only once their appointment to the cardinalate is announced publicly. In the Catholic Church, there is a tradition of the Pope appointing people to the status of cardinal in pectore, which means in his heart, and refers to the notion of popes appointing someone to the status of cardinal but not announcing the appointment publicly. When a cardinal is elected in pectore, he is seen, according to canon law, again both the pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II versions, as validly occupying his office, but does not have any of the rights, nor is bound by any of the duties of the cardinalate until his election is publicly announced. So, whenever a cardinal is chosen in pectore, he occupies the office of cardinal, but does not have the rights to actually make use of any of his authority as a cardinal until and unless his election is publicly announced. Now, it makes sense why they would believe this, because if Cardinal Siri and his supporters are being persecuted, then they would want to remain secret about the fact that they were truly the Pope. Nonetheless, one of the implications of this, according to canon law, is that if Cardinal Siri actually did appoint people to the status of cardinal, but did so in secret, then they wouldn't actually have any of the authority to do any of the stuff that a cardinal is normally expected to do, including electing a new pope. Thus, even if the first part of the Siri thesis is true, that Cardinal Siri was elected pope and that he appointed cardinals in secret, then the second part of the thesis, that Cardinal Siri has secret successors, is false, since they technically had no authority to elect a successor. There are also more practical questions. Cardinal Siri, until his death, continued to work in the Vatican. He never publicly challenged the popes who came to power from 1958 onward, who most supporters of the Siri thesis believe are false popes. He attended the Second Vatican Council and never publicly rejected it, which is problematic considering that most supporters of the Siri thesis believe that Vatican II is heretical. He celebrated both the pre-Vatican II and post-Vatican II forms of the Catholic Mass, the latter of which most supporters of the Siri thesis see as sacramentally invalid and even blasphemous. According to supporters of the Siri thesis, Cardinal Siri, to avoid the murder of his family and the increased persecution of Christians, could never go public about the reality of his papal election. He had to pretend not to be the Pope in order to avoid the negative consequences of going public with his papacy. The problem is, how does one tell the difference between, let's say, an undercover Pope and, on the one hand, someone who either isn't the Pope or is the Pope but doesn't believe themselves to be the Pope? How do you tell the difference between someone who just goes through the motions in partaking in a church council or giving reverence to a false Pope, and someone who actually accepts the authority of these popes or councils? Thus, to conclude this video, I would have to say that there's very little direct evidence in favor of this conspiracy theory. Like a lot of more popular conspiracy theories, a large chunk of the quote-unquote evidence in favor of it is looking at strange or irregular events and then just sort of filling in the blanks based on circumstantial evidence. Further, this theory causes more issues than it resolves. For if there's a secret line of bishops and cardinals wandering around somewhere, and we don't really know who they are, they would, by virtue of being secret cardinals and secret bishops, not really have the full extent of the authority that they would need in order to sustain this underground church. Nonetheless, it makes sense why a lot of people would believe this theory. They are responding to strange events in the history of the church. Further, a lot of the circumstantial evidence that they cite is stuff that's historically well documented. For example, the fact that Cardinal Siri was one of the best-known conservative churchmen in the Catholic religion at that time, the fact that he was a runner-up in a papal conclave, if not two or more, the fact that Freemasons and communists were historically antagonistic towards the Catholic Church. It also makes sense on a much broader level, that is, on a more emotional rather than strictly empirical level, why people would be attracted to this theory. During periods of upheaval in the church, people seek answers that will make everything sort of make sense again. You see this during the Middle Ages. The amount of corruption that existed in the church during the medieval period was through the roof. It kind of makes sense why you would see the rise of a lot of neo-Gnostic groups. Such groups were responding to the materialism, greed, and corruption of a lot of church leaders, which ran counter to the spiritual nature of the office that they held. All of this culminated in the early modern period during the Reformation. It makes sense why certain abuses or excesses in the church would lead to the rise of certain more radical Protestant sects who wanted to purify Christianity of anything that reminded it a little too much of Catholicism. Now, I'm not one of those people who believes that rad-trads are basically just Protestants in disguise. Like, they seem Orthodox, they seem Catholic, but when you dig beneath the surface, they're a lot more heretical than you think they are. Kind of like a Catholic version of High Church Episcopalians. I personally am not a big fan of that sort of rhetoric, but I think you see a similar psychological mindset. The church has been a mess since the middle of the last century. A lot of individual Catholics, as well as a lot of lower-ranking clergy, feel helpless to actually make the situation better. And further, it's easy to think that the church is against you when some of the things that you feel are antidotes to the crisis in the church, like the Latin Mass, are things that are being constantly attacked and suppressed. There is thus a desire to find an alternative to what you see in the mainstream church without outright leaving Catholicism. Some of these responses are canonically problematic. It thus seems easier to deal with the problem by saying, well, the current pope and the past few popes before him are invalid. The Second Vatican Council is invalid because it was called to order by a pope who really wasn't the pope. The notion that there's someone out there who can serve as an alternative to what you see in mainstream Catholicism provides an easy way out of the crisis in the church. And trust me, I agree, it's very difficult to associate with people in the church who are constantly doing things that you believe undermine the religion that you your entire life have believed to be the one true church founded by Jesus Christ. But just remember, Jesus predicted that there would be false believers infiltrating the ranks of the church, and therefore, God foreknew that there would be people in the church who would be doing things to interfere with the church carrying out her ministry. Like I've said before in a lot of discussions with people on this topic, the church has been through this before, and the church will go through this again. I mean, the periods of upheaval, turbulence, division, and corruption in the church that existed in the past would make some of the stuff that we face today seem like almost a non-issue. And even if the crisis in the church that emerged since the Second Vatican Council gets resolved sometime in the near future, it's very likely that there will be some other, possibly even worse issue or set of issues that will arise in the future. And we know that in the end times, the church will be persecuted almost to the point of non-existence. So the church has been through this before, and it's going to go through it again. What we need to do is trust in divine providence, not seek answers that ultimately lead us outside of the church or down these sort of sketchy rabbit holes. We need to retain communion with the one true church, headed by the visible hierarchy, and trust that God will continue to be at work in His church to resolve the issues that we currently face. So with this in mind, I'd like to thank you again for joining me, and God bless.